Hi, I'm Abram. Welcome once again to the new Yankee Workshop. Today we take a look back at a program we recorded a few years ago when we were on a This Old House project in Savannah, Georgia. It was our custom in those days, whenever we visited an interesting location, to scour the area for regional furniture projects. When we found one, we'd bring it back here to the workshop and build it. One of those is this small writing desk. Down there, they call it a planter's desk. Can't you imagine some cotton farmer coming home after a day in the hot fields and hitting his books at this desk in the cool shade of his plantation? I built this one from an original we found in Savannah, and it's used here in the shop for a variety of uses. I admire the scale and the simple lines, although if I were to build another one, I'd add a couple inches to these legs to give more clearance for a chair. I guess folks were a little bit shorter when the original was built. Another reason to like this project are the simple woodworking techniques used to build it. It's single plank construction for the most part, the top, the sides, and all the rails. The only piece that's a glue up is the lid, and that's only 2 boards joined together. The back is a series of boards connected with tongue and groove joinery, very easy to make on the table saw. The legs are connected to the rails with traditional mortise and tenon joinery, very strong. These legs start out square, and then they taper down, making the piece appear lighter and giving it a little more grace. These are all basic woodworking techniques. In a minute, we'll go down to Savannah to see the original, and then we'll come back here to build it. That's next, right here in the new Yankee Workshop. One of the nicest houses here on Taylor Street in Savannah is this one right here. The architectural style would be Second Empire Baroque. Now it's the home and the shop of Virginia and John Duncan. They sell antique maps, prints, and books. Now they're also collectors of antique Georgia furniture, and there's a piece I want you to see. Now out here on the back porch, you get a beautiful view of the garden. But down at this end is the piece I want you to see. John calls this a planter's desk. What I like about it is that it's not too massive. It has nicely tapered legs, held together with some hardwood pegs. The writing surface is slightly slanted down, and inside there's plenty of room for storage. Look at this. John's keeping his caulking gun and some old tools in this antique. Now at the back there's a little section of shelves. John keeps his pottery, but I could imagine keeping some books, and maybe even a small computer. This is a nice piece. We're going to have fun building it. I hope John and Virginia Duncan will be pleased with our version of their planter's desk. Now, I have yet to fill mine with tools and hardware, pottery and mugs, but it'll be a very useful project. As I was building the prototype, I realized that this is a good project for the woodworker trying to get some experience with their tools. We'll be making a tapered leg, primarily at the table saw. The rail is joined to the leg with a mortise and tenon joint. We'll make tongue and groove boards for the back, and we'll even make our own molding using a router table and the table saw. So if you'd like to build this planter's desk, a measure drawing is available with a materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. I built my version of the desk out of some recycled antique pine. This is the way I bought them. These are old floorboards. They came with all the nails removed, which was a plus, saving me some time. Now for the legs, I needed some timber, so I bought some pieces that were sawn out of larger beams. It's a white pine. Look at this. There's even a hardwood peg in this piece of timber. The first thing I want to do today is take some pieces of that timber and make it into the tapered legs. The first step is to make one flat surface, and that's best done at the joiner. But before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now I want to place that freshly jointed surface on the table saw and slide the fence over to just remove one of the other rough surfaces. That'll give me one 90-degree corner. The saw does a pretty good job, but to make that face perfect, I pass through the joiner. I will now use those two perfect edges against the fence and the table to rough out the other two sides, leaving me a blank that's a little bit bigger than what I need. The best tool to complete milling our leg is the surface planer. There is a cutter head that is parallel to a perfectly flat cast iron table. That assures me that as I run the piece through, the edges will be parallel. If I run adjacent edges, I have a square blank. Now we're ready to make those mortise and tenon joints that connect the rails to the legs. There are several ways to make mortises. You could rough them out at the drill press and then finish them off with a chisel, or you could use a mortising attachment on your drill press. That's fairly time-consuming to set up. I found the best tool is my designated mortiser. It has a square chisel with a drill bit to remove the material, a good fence system, and a hold down. Once the layout's done, it's quick work to make mortises. What could be easier? Let's look at the prototype again. If you look straight at the front, you can see that the legs are straight on the outside corner. On the inside, they're tapered. The taper starts about 8 inches down from the top, goes to the bottom to about half the width of the leg. Now, if I spin it around, you can see that the same thing happens on the side. This gives the piece a little bit of lightness. To taper the legs, I'm going to use my tapering jig. This is a homemade one that I made a few years ago. It has a hinge at the front end as a pivot, a bar at the back end to adjust it for different tapers, and a stop to help push the piece through. Once the taper's been laid out on the leg, I want to adjust the jig so that the layout is parallel to the saw blade. I use the miter gauge slot as a guide. I set a square right to the edge of the slot and then measure from the layout line to the square, both at the lower end of the leg and at the upper end of the leg. When the two measurements are equal, I know the setup is correct. Now I slide the jig and the blank over to the saw blade until I'm right at the beginning of the taper. Now I'm going to leave it a little bit strong so that I can clean it up at the joiner later. The important thing here is to keep the tapered surface flat on the bed of the joiner. Let's look at the prototype again. The writing surface of the desk slants towards the front. That means that the front leg is shorter than the back leg and that the top needs to be cut at a bevel. We'll do that now. Now I'm ready to make the tenons on the rails that'll fit into those mortises. And the first cut is the shoulder cut. And that's the most critical cut because that's where the rail will meet the leg, the joint that shows. It has to be square all the way around. I've set up a stop block for a 1 1/4 inch long tenon. I've raised the saw blade to 3/16 of an inch for the depth of the cut. And I'm going to use my miter gauge to guide the piece through. Now using a depth gauge, I'm going to raise the blade so that it's a 1/2 inch above the table and make the shoulder cut on the edge of each rail. The easiest way to complete the top and bottom cut of each tenon is at the bandsaw. To complete each tenon, I need to make the cheek cuts on each face. The best way to do that is to use a tenoning jig. It rides in the miter gauge slot of the table saw. It holds the piece vertically in position so that you can safely pass it through the saw. When I looked at the antique original, I couldn't tell what the bottom of the storage compartment was made out of because John had so many tools in his. I'm going to use some plywood because the boards are expensive. I'll probably paint it to cover it over later. Now to support that plywood, I'm going to need a groove in the rails, so I've set up my stacked dado head cutter for a 1/2 inch width, 3/8 of an inch depth, and 3/4 of an inch from the rip fence. I have no idea how the top of the original was attached to the bottom, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use some cleats, and those cleats need to sit in grooves. I don't want to use just nails or screws. I want a groove and a piece with a tongue. I need a stop dado on each side rail for this cleat, and I need another groove in the back rail for this little center cleat. To make those grooves, I'm going to use my router table, which I've set up with a 3/8 inch straight cutting bit and a height of 3/16 of an inch. I've also transferred some lines back to the fence that show me the leading and trailing edges of the bit. Now, for one of the stop dados, I'm going to have to drop the piece onto the bit. I line it up with the leading edge of the bit, drop it down, push it through. Now, for the back rail, the groove will go end to end. The corners of the plywood bottom need to be notched to fit around the legs. This process is known as dry fitting. I want to put everything together to make sure it fits properly before I glue it up. I also want to lay out the slope that I have to cut on the side rails. That'll go from the top of the leg back to this mark right here. Straight edge and a line will take care of that. Also, I want to mark the front rail to show how much I have to trim off to make it flush with the leg. Now the tapering jig makes easy work of cutting that slope. And notice I left it strong. We'll clean it up at the joiner. With the fence on the joiner tipped to 6 degrees, I can bevel the top of that front rail. Now, in these places where the rails meet the legs, it's better to sand them now. You can't reach them later. Now I can glue it up, and I'm just applying a coat of good carpenter's glue to the tenons, and I'll put some in the mortises. We'll assemble it and clamp it. Now I'll just slip the plywood bottom in before I put the front assembly together. No glue on the plywood. This setup is to make the rabbets in the cleats, which will secure the top. I've set up my stack dado head cutter for a 1/4 inch width, installed a sacrificial fence so I won't hit the metal fence. The height is 3/8, the depth is 3/16. This short piece that I just ran will be the center cleat. That fits good. Now we'll make the ones for the corners. Okay, that fits pretty good. Now I'm just going to knock off these corners so that when you reach in the desk, you won't have a sharp point there. A little bit of glue and a clamp will take care of the cleats. Now I want to start working on the desk top, and I first want to glue up a blank for the lid. It's about 15 inches wide, so I've selected 2 boards that are similar in color and texture. I've jointed the edges so that the joint will be invisible when it's glued up. I've put witness marks for some biscuits, so I'll cut the biscuits first, then we'll glue it up. Well, overnight my blank for the top dried nicely, and I finished sanding the base. Now it's time to get working on the fixed part of the top. I have this 12-inch wide board that overhangs the sides by about 3/4 of an inch, and I need a stop dado on each end, and that's going to receive the side pieces of the open storage. They'll sit right in those dados. I also need a rabbet along the back edge of that piece to receive the backboards. There's another piece for the top of the open storage, same width, needs the same stop dado on each end, and a rabbet for the back. We'll make those at the router table. I'll be using the same techniques you saw me use earlier, except now I have a 3/4 inch diameter bit, and I've installed a new piece of tape for the leading and trailing edges. Now for the top piece, I need to move the fence a little bit further away from the bit. So I just loosen it up, push it back, use my depth gauge until it just meets the cutter head. Now it's not important that the fence be parallel to the edge of the table. What's important is the distance to the bit. Now for that rabbet along the back. I want it to run from dado to dado. I'm using the same bit, but I've slid the fence right over to about the center of the bit. It'll take 2 passes to make the rabbet. Now the trick here is to bring the piece in through that dado, run it through, and not come through the edge. The side pieces for the open storage need cross dados to receive the shelves and a rabbet along the back edge to conceal the back boards. That's easiest to do with the table saw with the stacked dado head cutter. And I'm going to use my miter gauge to guide the piece through. For the rabbet, the same stacked dado and a sacrificial fence, just run the pieces through. The lid of the original had rounded edges, but the fixed part had been left square. I think it looks better to round everything, so I want to do that next. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch quarter round bit in my router with a guide bearing, which will ride against the edge. Because the lid slants towards the front, this joint needs to be beveled. The angle is 3 degrees. Now here at the joiner, I know that you can hardly see it, but I've actually tipped this fence 3 degrees to run that edge. This would be the time to start assembling the shelves. A little bit of glue and some brads. Now the nails that I'm using are 1 1/4 inch brads, and I don't want them to show, so this toenailing method will conceal them. Now I don't mean to confuse you, but this is actually the bottom. And we'll just slip it over the side pieces, and I will through nail these because they'll be hidden inside the desk. And finally the top piece. And now I just check the diagonals, and if they're equal, I know it's square. And that's good. So we'll let that set, and while it sets, we'll manufacture some boards for the back. The boards on the back are joined together with a tongue and groove joint at the edge. I'm set up here to make the groove. I'm using the 2 outside saw blades of my dado headset, no chippers. Now in order to have that groove perfectly centered, flip it around, run it through again. I've just run a test piece for the tongue. To make that, I'm using the same cutters. I've installed a sacrificial fence. A pass on each side is all it takes. Now, I like to put a slight chamfer on the boards where they meet. Gives it a nice little detail. I've removed the groove from one of the boards, and that'll be my starter piece. I'm going to leave about 1/8 of an inch gap along the edge to allow for some expansion. I'm going to secure the pieces with 1 1/2 inch brads, face nailing at the edge, and toenailing the tongue. Well, now with the case flipped upside down, I'm going to install a cleat at the top edge, and that will pick up the rail of the face frame. Now here is that face frame, just dry fit in place so that I can mark out for some biscuit slots to secure it to the carcass. The good thing about using biscuits is that they won't show in the finished construction. Now, even though the biscuits help align the face frame, it's the combination of the glue and the biscuit that secures it. To dress up the top of the shelves, I have this piece of molding. I'll show you how I made it at the router table. I'm going to start forming the molding with a 1-inch round nose bit. Now I'm switching to a V-groove bit. Now I need to add an auxiliary fence, just a piece of wood beveled at 15 degrees along the top. When I built the prototype, I saved a piece of the molding as I was forming it so I could use it to do the setup. I want to slide the fence into the bit. With my saw now tipped to 35 degrees, I'm going to trim off a little more material to get to the profile I want. With the saw blade now tipped to 45 degrees, I'm going to cut into the half round section. With the saw blade now tipped to 90 degrees, I can trim the bottom edge. We'll cut the 45-degree miters here at the miter box. Well, this is the quarter round profile on the lid. Hinges are next. To lay out the mortise for the hinge, I like to use the hinge itself and a sharp utility knife to just score the outline. After that's complete, I'll remove the bulk of material freehand using my router and a straight cutting bit, and I'll clean it all up with a good sharp chisel. All right, with the hinges installed, the woodworking is done. Now we're ready for the finishing room. Now here's the finishing schedule for our planter's desk. To kill the grain of the plywood bottom on the inside, I applied a coat of primer and then a color coat of latex acrylic enamel paint. Now for all the exterior pine that shows, I'm using a pastel stain. This is called winter white. And I apply a fairly heavy coat with a foam brush, and I'll let it set for a few minutes. Well, now I'm ready to wipe the stain, and it isn't completely dry, and I don't want it to be completely dry. Just using a clean rag, I can rub off the excess, and I can really control the color that I end up with and the amount of the wood grain that shows through. Now when I get it just the way I want it, I'm going to let it set for about 24 hours. And then I'm going to protect the whole piece with a nice coat of polyurethane. I hope that John and Ginger Duncan will be pleased with our version of their planter's desk. And as I recall, theirs was filled with tools and caulking guns and hardware. I think it's much too nice of a piece for that. Maybe I'll keep some of my office supplies in there. Now next time, another Georgia antique. This one we found in a private collection. It's called a turkey table. Now we have no idea why it's called a turkey table, but it's the perfect size as a side table or an end table. Place for the lamp or the telephone. And I'll show you how to build one next time right here in the new Yankee Workshop.